Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Crystal, and I'm the community manager at Ning. I'm here with Ric Dragon, CEO and co founder of Dragon Search, and your presenter this hour on the topic of creating healthy communities in social media. Tolstoy famously opened his novel Anna Karenina with "Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." The same could be said of communities. There is a strong similarity to a dysfunctional community and a dysfunctional family. In this webinar, Ric is going to discuss some of the underlying concepts behind what makes for healthy communities in social media. This is our first time hosting Ric, and we're delighted to have his expertise join our ongoing series of community management talks. All of our previous recorded presentations are available on the Ning blog at cultivate.ning.com. We'll also be uploading the recording for today's presentation as well. So if you missed part of it or just want to revisit it at a later date, we've got you covered. As questions arise throughout this webinar, please go ahead and submit them using the questions feature. Submit as many as you like, and we'll take some time at the end to respond to as many as we can. I also invite you all to contribute to the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag NingTalk. Our presenter today is Ric Dragon. He is an author, a CEO, a co-founder, an artist, a regular guest columnist, but I'll let him tell you a little bit more about himself. So without much further ado, here is Ric Dragon.
Thank you, Crystal, and good morning, everybody, wherever you are, and for those of you in places where it's the afternoon, good evening, good night. It's wonderful to share this thinking with you. These are topics that I'm very passionate about, and they tie in with what we do in social media and as a result in marketing, so it's very exciting. A little bit about myself. That is a very recent picture of me with my favorite hat. As Crystal said, I am an author. I wrote a book called Social Marketology. I invite you to pick it up at your local library, or better yet, buy a copy. I am a jazz drummer, an artist, a painter. I run this organization, do quite a few different things, but most of the time these days I write and speak about social media. So the interesting thing about this whole word of community, even today, every single day we find ourselves sort of stumbling over this word. Yesterday I posted this particular event on Facebook as an event, and some of my friends came on, and Tim McDonald from the Huffington Post, he heads off communities there, came on and said, again, the problem is people see Facebook as a community. It's not a community. So we started having a little back and forth just about the word community, and it's very interesting that it invites so much discussion and quite often disagreement on what it means. So I always like to head back over to the Latin origin of the word. It's very simple, communis, very, very simply meant that it was a group of townspeople. That's all it meant at the time when it was first used. So it really, etymologically speaking, there's not a big basis for how we use community today. Things have changed. People all of a sudden, at various times in history, all of a sudden could start traveling. You could get on a boat and cross the ocean. So again, part of your family might be over here and part of your family might be over there. We have technology that enables us to communicate. So all of a sudden we're down in our basements with our ham radios talking to people on the other side of the world, talking about those things that in fact we share with one another, in effect creating a virtual community. And today, of course, with social media, there's communities all over the place. So I like to think in terms of a little bit about what community means and how the word that we use is evolving. See if my PowerPoint will work here. So if we first take the notion of just what a group is any conglomerate of people, whether it's online or it's an actual place. A whole bunch of us could be standing here in the room. And then we have teams. Now teams are pretty unique as well. Teams typically have a common purpose. They're trying to achieve something. They're trying to win a game. They're trying to take another group of, get a project accomplished or finish the task. Teams are very different as well, although they have a lot in common sometimes with communities. We have tribes. The word tribe, tribus, tribe was actually one of the original groups in Rome. It's interesting that the notion of tribes and communities both go back to the Latin. And then later it was meant to talk about the groups of Jews across Europe, so that they were the tribes. So tends to be a sense of consanguinity, that we share common blood, that we're somehow related to one another. And that's where the notion of tribes has come. A lot of people have taken some of the notions of tribes and extended them into communities as well, and there's some fabulous overlap for us to talk about. And then finally, we do have that sense of community and what communities mean. Now, yesterday in my conversation online with Tim McDonald, sort of came to the conclusion that a community, as opposed to simply a group, is where at least people are communicating with one another. So that, if I'm just a bunch of people in my office right now, we're not communicating, we really wouldn't say we're a community. We may be all here to listen to that person speak, but right now we're not a community. But the second that we can start communicating with one another, we can start to form community, and talk a little bit about what that's about. Now, it's probably worth it to go a little bit into, sorry, another screen on there just talking about society is just another element of the discussion. What is society on top of all that? Now, the thing is, all of these words have very fluid meanings. We can go back to the etymology. We can talk about how they're used in psychology and sociology. They're extremely fluid. So I would urge you not to get too hung up on those meanings, but still, they're worth discussing and having more discussions about. Now, we get into the whole notion of networks and network theory that's been very popular. Now, we talk about the nodes, those particular black points, those are us. And then we're connected with one another. We have dryads and triads. We have different forms of groups. Now, network theory, these things that bind us, are called ties. Now, the problem with network theory and the whole concept of ties is they tend to be rather one-dimensional or two-dimensional. There really is so much more to our human relationships. What is a tie if I happen to like you but you don't like me? Is it just a line? Or if I know you but you don't know me? So another form of theory that's grown up around this whole world of thinking is graph theory. Now, you'll hear that spoken about a lot with Facebook. They tend to talk in terms more of graph theory than network theory. And as opposed to ties that connect us, they talk in terms of edges. And any two of us, or any three of us, or a multiple group, can have different edges, can have multiple edges, and it's a lot richer way of talking about relationships and how we get together. Now, the interesting thing with groups that we talk about is the whole sense of in-group and out-group. And this is a notion in psychology and sociology that's frequently spoken about, and it's extremely, extremely powerful, because we have a sense of when we belong to a group, it actually changes how we think of ourselves. So our development of our own theory of mind is very closely tied with the groups that we associate with, which is probably why we decide to associate with some groups as opposed to others. Now, the interesting thing is some particular studies that have been done that talk about sort of how we favor our own group. One very popular study was a study in which people came into a room and were each separated based on something as arbitrary as the flip of a coin. So your heads, you're over here in that group. Your tails, you're over here in that group. And then later they would ask people to distribute a certain amount of wealth in any way that they wanted in the room, and found that people favored their own group, simply on a very small element of identity. Where it gets rich is where we belong to multiple groups at the same time. I may belong to the group of middle-aged men who are bald, but amongst that group might be a subgroup of people with hair that are also marketers. So which group do I belong to has a lot to do with how I shape my sense of self. Now, these notions of in-group and out-group powers, forces that are in play, are always there, and are very worth sort of digging into and understanding for us as community managers and people who work in social media. Another favorite study of mine, there were a lot of wonderful studies that came out of post-World War II. I think people were faced with the atrocities of World War II and were like, oh my God, how can people behave this way? So they came back and they said, well, let's form these studies and see if we can figure it out. And one of the very famous ones is the Asch Conformity study. Now you can see they put up these cards or these screens that looked a lot like the one you see in front of you. And you can see Exhibit 1, the line is so long. Now, any one of us probably would look over at Exhibit 2 and say, which one of those lines matches Exhibit 1, right? It's obviously A. Well, when they did the study, they would have a line of people go through a series of these things, and maybe the guy who's being studied is the one furthest to the right, and they would start with the guy at the 1, and the guy at the 1 position, he would say, oh, well, B. And the second person would say B, and the third person, and on down the line, they would say B, and it would finally get to that fifth person, and they would see him struggling, and he would say B. He would agree with the group. It's a powerful thing, and it's seen over and over. If you look on YouTube and you look up Asch Conformity Study Elevator, there was this wonderful little thing that the Candid Camera did, where they had a guy. He's on an elevator, and 3 other people would get on, and they would all face the back of the elevator. And quite often, the person who wasn't in on the study or the joke, so to speak, would he would struggle, but he would turn and face the back of the elevator too. We are wired to conform to the people around us most of the time. Now, this is very interesting power that's at play in communities it's worth knowing about. Now, we can see where brands use this in things like, in this particular example, this is Red Bull. And if you look at what Red Bull does, Red Bull never talks about the stuff in the can, that sort of yellow fluid that kind of smells funny. They don't talk about that. They talk about things like people living in extreme ways, people doing extreme sports. And they put that logo on things like race cars and stadiums and nightclubs because they're helping to identify with those sentiments that they want you to identify. So that if you're part of that group and have in-group sensibility towards extreme living, you're going to feel a very strong affinity with that brand. And that's what they're after in that case. Now, the other thing that we see happening in communities consistently is the struggle for power. Now, there's power in a lot of different ways. Power can simply be, the fact that, well, I've been here a long time, and I know some information about our early history that you don't know. There's a sense of power in that. It's not necessarily leadership, although typically you'll see people sort of struggling for a leadership position in a community. And it's very natural. You can take a group of people, you can put them in a room, they've never met one another, and within 2 hours they're sort of struggling, well, gee, who's going to be the dominant person here who sort of calls the shots? We see that all the time. The other thing we see in communities consistently is the need to develop language that helps identify us as belonging to a particular in-group. Now, a very interesting phenomenon that people have observed is the fact that in society, a lot of language change comes from teenage girls. They tend to be the leaders of language change in our society. And you'll often notice that girls, particularly as teens, are really forming groups and subgroups and have very sense of strong in-group identity. But by saying, using certain patois, they started the LOL phenomenon, the computer speak or Valley Girl talk, these things that they developed was a way of saying, well, you understand me, you're part of my in-group. Whereas that person over there doesn't talk like that, they're not part of our group. And most certainly, because we're at a stage in our life where we need to differentiate from our parents, they certainly don't belong to our group because they don't speak like us and they don't understand our language even. So it's very powerful. You'll see this happening in communities where they develop their own language as a means to identify one another. It's a way that others cannot come into the community immediately. They'll always be seen as outsiders until they develop that language ability. Now, we also see the need for communities to form origin myths. How did we form? People who have a very strong history in the community will understand those origin myths. They also develop little stories so that they can talk about the shared history. Now, it's a way, it's a code, if you will, that no one else will necessarily understand until they have a longer history in the community. So that's another pattern that we see in communities, that development of shared history and origin myths. I'm going to borrow a little bit here from Professor Paul Moxness. Now, Moxness talked about the idea that within communities we tend to have certain archetypal roles. Now, archetypal roles, or deep roles as he called them, are not necessarily all-inclusive, and there's different patterns of deep roles, but this is one system that he proposed was based on the European fairy tale interpretation, where you've got that father, that leader, or mother, who's the leader, the god, the queen, and then you often have the inverse of the positive attributes. You've got the person who's playing the role of the devil or the witch. We see the son role, the daughter role. Now, you might question that. You might say, oh, geez, we're just a community. We're not doing all that. But if you look closely, you'll often see these family roles played out. Now, the family ultimately is that role that most of us have been modeled on. Most of us were raised in families. Now, we see that as an organization where very young people, for instance, grow up in a family. They often usually have parents, they usually have siblings, and they take that pattern of relationship out into the real world when they get a job. We see that particularly around problem solving, for instance, when a person is very accustomed to getting their allowance from a parent, they're accustomed to getting driven around and maybe getting their college application in with help from their parent. But then they finally get through college, they come and they get their first job and they look, oh, I've got a problem. Boss, can you solve it? Or boss, you're bad because you're not giving me a raise. And they start treating the boss, they do that projection we see. Now, that doesn't mean everybody does that. It doesn't mean it exists in all communities. It's just that we can often see these patterns taking place. Now, one of my favorites that I see here is that of the black sheep. Now, the black sheep, or going down to the bottom right, the clown, if you will, we see in communities over and over where you can have a happy little community and somebody has to come in and sort of stir things up. Things are too balanced. So the black sheep or the clown will come in and they might be snarky. They might question somebody else. They might just say, you guys are full of crap. You know, come on, get real here, and shake things up. I love that role. I see it quite often in communities and actually think it's a positive role, so that when you see it, instead of getting annoyed by it, and if you understand the dynamic that's taking place, you can actually understand it as a positive part of the healthy community. Adam Kimiak. Now, Adam Kimiak is the head of digital and marketing over at Campbell Soup. Real smart guy, writes some wonderful, wonderful blogs. He proposed a model, if you will, of the community based on these 5 roles. Now, the voyeur, the person who's just sitting back and listening. They're not really participating. Now, Kimiak doesn't say that voyeurs are bad. Voyeurs are still a very important member of the community. You need those people to participate. They're there. We've got the instigators. That's not unlike that clown or the black sheep I just spoke about. The facilitator is not necessarily the host. There's a lot of confusion between those two. The facilitator really helps to make sure that people are happy. They're the person who frequently, in a family situation, helps act as an arbiter between opposing forces. Same thing in communities. The popular ones are very important. They help get enthusiasm around a community. They help get people going on a particular topic. And then there's the host, the people who really make the community happen. They're doing the underlying work, if you will. Now, you might take issue with Kimiak's model of the community and say, you know, gee, I'm not necessarily seeing this, but I'm suggesting that as a model, as a mental model of the community, it could be helpful. And if you apply it to your own community, you might find that these patterns exist and can actually help you solve problems. Reciprocity is the touchstone of social capital. Robert Putnam wrote a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I would definitely say it's in the top 20 books to be read by anybody who's doing, in fact, if you're doing community work, it's in the top 5 books. One of the things that Putnam, a professor, discovered as they started looking at data is that over the history of the United States, the participation in voluntary organizations has most certainly gone down. There's been a nice upward tick in the past decade, but certainly from the 40s and 50s into the 60s and 70s, there was a major downward trend. People used to belong to a lot of community organizations. A lot of that now has moved online, of course. Well, he talks about reciprocity. Reciprocity is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. There's a lot of wonderful studies. One of my favorites is the famous Coca-Cola study, where somebody's asked to come in and fill out a questionnaire. They're going to participate in the study. They're going to get paid. They come in. They're going to fill out the questionnaire. The second person comes in. Now, they're in on the study, and they go, "Hi, I'm here for the study, too." And they go to the Coke machine. They come back. "Yeah, I thought I'd get you a Coke. And here's a Coca-Cola." And at the end of the study, they've been there for a half hour. At the end, the person who bought the Coke turns to the other person and says, "By the way, my son is selling some raffle tickets for school. Would you buy some?" And in well over 50% of the cases, closer to 70%, the person would buy the raffle tickets. And that was phenomenal. Now, they also did these studies in restaurants where they found that the giving, the unexpected giving of a gift, raised tips by over 70%. We've seen this pattern over and over. It was seen, Robert Cialdini, one of the great thinkers on influence, frequently wrote about the Hare Krishna in airports and how they would come up to you and thrust a flower in your hands and say, "This is a gift." And then they would ask for money. And the majority of people would go ahead and give money to these people. The power, the overwhelming feeling that we have, we're hardwired to reciprocate when given gifts. This is why the Easter seals, a lot of the things we get in the mail, they send you those little gummy labels with the address labels on them and then say, "Now will you give us money?" Because they gave you a gift first. And they found that over and over it had a big element to play in influence. Now, we see this in communities where people's need to be paying it forward constantly with one another without the need for something in return. Because if there was anywhere along the line, all of a sudden the person, the giver signals that they want something in return, all of a sudden all that giving is suspect and we don't trust it anymore. But when we're around people who give willingly of themselves, we're much more apt to give back to them. Now, this has been talked a lot about, is going back to us as animals and how we really need to feel protected and safe with one another. So if we weren't generous with one another, we weren't going to protect one another when attacked by a common predator. Tuckman's 5 phases, often used in teamwork, is a model that's worth pulling out. I've seen this happen with online communities fairly consistently. We talk about the stage of forming. That's when we're just getting together. Things are usually pretty exuberant. We're forming a group. We're forming a community. This is a fabulous thing. We tend to go into storming mode pretty quickly. Now, storming mode is when we start struggling for who's in control, who's got the power here, who's going to be the voice of the community, who's going to say what our traditions are. And you'll see that sometimes this will frequently go back and forth from storming to norming. Norming is where we've decided who we're going to be, and sometimes it'll flow between these 2 cycles very quickly. Now, in teamwork, of course, we get to a point where we're an efficient group and we're doing the work we need to perform our work. And of course, if we're a team, we're here for a certain purpose, so we're finally going to adjourn. But as community managers and people who are in charge of communities, we can usually expect that forming, storming, norming to happen very, very consistently, over and over. A dear friend of mine used to say that at dinner parties we get together, and as people are, where do I sit? Where do I sit? Well, the 48-hour rule is that you shouldn't sit next to anyone who you've had sex with in the past 48 hours. That was a joke. But the idea that when you're creating communities, it's very good to mix it up. And the same is true as we develop our own networks, that if we develop connections with people who are weak ties, as they're called, as opposed to strong ties, frequently a lot of wonderful magic will happen in the form of community building. So how can you help engender more weak ties? Now, there was a guy named Mark Granovetter wrote a seminal book back in the 70s about this topic, and what he discovered in studying it was that it was through the weak ties that we discover new language, new books, new cultural ideas, and in his case, new jobs. We don't find those things out from the people who are already closest to us because we've already shared a lot of that information. But by extending out our networks and pulling in weak ties, new introductions, it helps bring, if you will, almost like a new genetic material into the play, but in this case, it's new mind material, new thinking, new ways. Diversity over and over has been shown to create richer and more healthy communities. So part of your job as community manager is to foster diversity. And how do you do that? But you have to make sure that diversity is not squelched, which is frequently the tendency in those in-group connections. Because again, we go back to sharing language. Hey, we share these attributes, but this new genetic material has come into the room and we want to push them out. That's a natural tendency that you want to help fight to create a richer, better community. Another phenomenon we frequently see in communities is people will come together to overcome adversity. Really great leaders will often use this to help pull a nation together or pull a state or a community together. We have a post-flood. Hurricane Irene hit a community. These people, many of them hadn't spoken to one another in the past 10 years. But when faced with a common problem, they come together to overcome that problem. This is called resilience. Now, finally, to my favorite part of today's talk is this whole notion of dysfunctional communities, dysfunctional families. You know, it's funny. Whether you yourself think of your own family as dysfunctional or not, we typically don't. And then we bring home someone for dinner at Thanksgiving or Christmas, and you, on the way home, your mate or boyfriend or girlfriend turns to you and goes, "Oh my God, what a dysfunctional family." Or you yourself, you see it as you've never seen it before, because usually those holidays really, really bring it out. And it's funny how families can be dysfunctional. It's very rare that you can see a model family where you go, "Oh, there's no dysfunction here." Dysfunction is rampant, but there's different levels of dysfunction. When you really have a clinical case of dysfunctional family, you frequently have someone who's an alcohol or drug abuser in the family group and helping to foster that dysfunction. Now, there are a whole list of points that are usually used to describe dysfunctional families. I've borrowed 4 very major ones that I see that cross over into communities. Lack of empathy is one of the biggest. Empathy is not just when we can feel sorry for someone, but when we really feel with them. We can feel their pain. We can identify with it. Empathy is a very powerful human emotion. Humans, but we can also feel it, for instance, in this case with a dog. You know, can I empathize with this dog? When you have a group setting and people are lacking in empathy for one another, that is fundamentally dysfunctional. Bad things will happen. When people feel for one another, good things happen. They tend to be a lot more forgiving and charitable with one another. The elephant in the room means there's some big element at play here. You know, oh, Cousin Johnny's in prison, but we're not going to talk about it. You'll see that in dysfunctional families, but you'll also see it in dysfunctional communities when things become taboo, when something cannot be talked about, when yet it needs to be talked about. In a dysfunctional family, there's a sense of boundaries that become very blurred. Somebody comes in on somebody's space when they shouldn't. Somebody intrudes on a certain psychological element that they shouldn't, and they cross over. They don't know when they shouldn't. In communities, a very strong respect for, and it goes back to empathy also, that we feel for one another, but we know the boundaries and respect those boundaries. Conflict extremes. Now, this does not mean that conflict is bad. Conflict can be very, very healthy. When you have a group of people, though, where there's too much conflict or too little conflict, that is fundamentally dysfunctional. And if you see that type of situation, you want to bring that out in the open and discuss it, talk about it, and try to help work in a situation where you are allowed to have conflict and it feels safe. In a dysfunctional family, you can't often have conflict because it just doesn't feel safe, or you just have way too much. Somebody comes in, they're smashing boundaries, they're being violent and extreme, and that's just horrible. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you're allowed to question, you're allowed to question authority. In cases where you don't have that, that's where you have cults that take place. Cults are a situation where all of a sudden you have an authority figure, and what they say is the law, period, and no one dare questions it, or else they face being expelled from the cult. You cannot have that. There has to be allowance for questioning leadership, allowance for questioning the status quo, but it has to be done respectfully. We see inequality or unfairness in dysfunction. When someone is treated in a way that others are not treated, when someone is favored and the other is not favored. In a dysfunctional family, one child may be seen as the black sheep. They're seen as the scapegoat. We blame everything on them. We don't give them as much, and then child B is the wonderful child, and everything they do is fabulous, and we're going to shower them with gifts and ice cream. That's fundamentally dysfunctional. You will see that quite frequently. It's a hallmark of a dysfunctional family. Communities, we tend to see this a little bit less. Again, it's a whole ecosystem, so that if you're lacking in conflict and someone is treated unfairly or unequally, others cannot speak up. In a healthy community, people will be able to speak up and go, hey, that's not fair, let's change that. So these are all hallmarks, things to look out for, that if you see these things happen, they're fairly good indicators that dysfunction may be creeping into the community dynamic, and they're things for you as the community manager to help work through. Another concept of community is a community that is not necessarily long and enduring. It's Gary Allen Fine and his co-writer Lisa Jo Vandenscott came up with the notion of wispy communities. Now, in a wispy community, for instance, this particular group, they get together and they have a Lebowski Fest every year. It's a week long. It's funny, I gave this part of this presentation at a symposium in San Diego, and somebody said, hey, I know one of those people in that photograph. And they identify so strongly with this particular event, and they go home and they hang photographs. There's a very strong emotional connection in a wispy community. You see that around people who attend Blog World or people who go to Burning Man. They bring that home and they try to continue those emotional ties. Now, if you're working at all with wispy communities, you know that you can actually use some of those attributes. If you're handing out gifts at a wispy community, you want something that's going to help reinforce that emotional tie. Or if we bring it home and we create a Facebook community, it helps to extend what we're doing back there in those annual events, for instance. This is a photograph of a group, or a portion, a very, very small portion of a group called #UsGuys on Twitter. You may have seen them. Many of you who are attending today's webinar may actually join them. I bring them up because they were a wonderful example of a virtual community that took place with nothing more than a hashtag. It originated when 5 guys were on Twitter, and they kept tweeting back and forth to the entire group, and each time they did, they would have to list everybody's name, and it was just long and onerous. It made the tweet short, so they came up with the hashtag #UsGuys. And the beginning of the group sort of started, these 5 guys just talking about marketing. And then little by little, other people joined the group and started using the hashtag. So it was like a tweet chat, but it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was all the time. And what was very interesting about #UsGuys, if you sat back and watched it form, is that it went through Tuckman's phases of group formation. People were, one of the first conflicts that came up was one of the original 5 people said, we need rules. And a whole lot of people said, nope, we don't want rules. So there was conflict around that. And in fact, at one point, someone was going to splinter off and start a new group. In fact, the new group did start for the discussions, and they had rules. And that was okay. Other things, they developed certain historical elements, or a history, a shared history, that they could talk about. The people who participated in Us Guys knew about the formation of the group, and that there were these 5. They called them the elders. Very, very, very tribal in many ways. In fact, they talked about ringing the tribal bell. When a new person joined Us Guys, they would type, oh, ring the tribal bell, and bwong. And so they started to develop their own cultural attributes in this group. It was very interesting that they went through these very things, and they actually exhibited a lot of the various behaviors that we talk about in communities. It was based on nothing more than a hashtag. That's phenomenal if you think about it. Communities can form in all sorts of places. Communities can form, I believe they can form for very short periods of time in the back of a grocery store line. We can come together and say, wow, look, we're in the express line, and that guy's got 24 items, and we can come together in a group and not like the fact that somebody is not being fair, and we can form a community around this, and it may only last 10 minutes. That point's argued. Again, some people say, well, no, that's not a community. But again, the entire term of what a community is actually quite up for grabs still. A couple of other elements that are worth noting. I want to bring in Robin Dunbar, who is a British psychologist. He is a man, despite the name Robin. He's got a great big full beard, very smart guy. He introduced 2 notions that I think are worth knowing about. One is the Dunbar number. We hear this frequently spoken about. It's often misinterpreted. What Dunbar did was he noticed that primates tended to aggregate in similarly sized groups. So chimpanzees formed in this size group, bonobos in this size group, gorillas in this size group. And he wondered if there was a correlation between the group size and the size of the cerebral cortex. So he took measurements of skulls and brains and then said, based on that, how large should a human group be? And the number came to be around 140. And what it meant, that 140 number, is not that we can't have groups that are larger than that, certainly not that we can't have groups that are smaller than that, but that at around 140, we can have a stable social network. That if you get larger than that, it's very difficult for any one of us to understand the relationships of all the others to one another. And if you think about it, you take 10 people in a room, for me to understand each of their relationships with one another is a lot of data to hold on to. So certainly at 140, it becomes extremely, extremely complex. But that does not mean that we can't have groups that are larger than that. But a lot of people actually have found that the best size for an organization is somewhere under that number. There's companies that have decided to use that as a cutoff point, and at the 140 number, 150 number, they form a new organization or a new factory. Other groups have used that quite frequently. Now, another element that Dunbar brought into play was that gossip is an extension of social grooming. Social grooming is also called allo-grooming. It's this thing that all mammals do with one another. Cats lick one another, monkeys pick nits. This is social grooming. And Dunbar hypothesized that our gossip, our chatter, our getting together and saying, hey, good weather, how was that ball game on Saturday night, is an extension of social grooming. Now, the phenomenon of social grooming has been seen with various impacts. One is that increases the neurotransmitter dopamine. And then finally, oxytocin. These are the neurotransmitters that make us feel good about one another and feel good in one another's company. Dopamine is also stimulated by social media in general, so it comes into play quite a bit here. But the thing is that when individuals in any group of animals, mammals in particular, do social grooming with one another, they've been shown to come to one another's help when threatened by predators over and over. And so what this suggests to us that in community development and the work that we do in social is that frequently that small talk that we do is very, very important. It plays a very strong role and is not to be eschewed. In my own experiments, one of the things I noted was that if I was to go onto Twitter into a particular group and announce, I've got the cure for cancer, I'll frequently encounter crickets, radio silence. I'm not getting any replies. But if I first come into the room and I talk about small talk, how's that weather, how's that game, what are you doing today? I sure could use another cup of coffee. And by the way, I've got the cure for cancer. All of a sudden, I've got all sorts of interactions happening around with that information. It's very important to bring in that small talk first. It helps engender trust so that we as human beings know that we can speak with one another. And that concludes this deck. Thank you. I hope I've got some questions from you guys.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was fantastic. I kept looking up different research papers that you were mentioning, so I'm going to have a lot of resources to look into this afternoon. We did have a couple of questions, and feel free to continue to ask some questions. We'll probably have time for about 3 or 4 questions. So first off, Ted Schachter wanted to ask, do you see Starbucks, for example, as an example of language binding communities around brands? And do you have any other particular brands that are really good at kind of conflating this language and community?
That's a great example, Ted. Starbucks does it. Certainly if you're a typical customer, you know the right way to ask for a particular frappuccino, skinny, blah, 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 marks you as a member of the tribe, so to speak. And they also, Starbucks uses a lot of other techniques, that knowing of names. Hey, what's your name? They don't really need your name for the transaction, but if the person delivering your coffee to you can go, hey, Ted, here's your coffee, it just adds to that bonding a little bit. They do it quite well. They're one of the best examples. I'm not sure about creating a patois. Certainly, Zappos uses a lot of great techniques to engender more familiarity. We see, branding-wise, if you see Lady Gaga has her followers, and she gives them a special name. I know of an entertainer who calls his followers his monkeys, and those little nicknames that they can create for one another can help create that. So yeah, brands can definitely use it. We also see in certain brands where somebody is given a particular status. That's another place where we see it. Huffington Post has people of varying status. By the way, I mentioned Huffington Post, it's very interesting that very recently they instituted more rules and more structure around you can't post anonymously. They started that last year. And these rules actually helped create stronger communities, and having leaders in the community actually created stronger communities as well.
That's really interesting.
I got away from that question a little bit.
Okay, another question. Jim Vitkus would be interested to know your thoughts on how the wired medium affects biology, like body language and emotional ties, compared to face-to-face connections.
Okay, let's say that one again. That was complex. Thank you, Jill.
It is. It's very complex. How the wired medium of online social media interactions affects body language, emotional ties in comparison to face-to-face connections.
Oh, it is true. Yeah, online, of course, there's so many social cues that we miss. And it's interesting, for instance, when I talk about the us guys, that frequently the people who are really, really adept at community management actually know how to bring in a simulation, a lot of those things. One of my favorite community managers would frequently have almost like stage directions where she would say leans in or nudges with the elbow, to bring in some of that physicality. Most certainly it's not the same thing. We don't have, it's very difficult for us to read one another's language. So now we use emoticons, for instance. There's a whole segment of people out there who will say, don't use LOL. Don't use RFOL. Don't do that. It's childish. You're acting like a teenager. And yet, frequently what you'll see in the written word in online communities is these things are little replacements for those visual elements that we would have in real life. So that if I make a statement and I go LOL, or I give you a smiley face, it means that I don't mean it with harm. I'm showing you a little smile, right? We do that in real person as well. So people have adapted and found little visual cues to give, but it certainly isn't as rich as the real world. And I just caught myself saying the real world, and that's an interesting thing because we use IRL in the real world. Good to meet you, IRL. And people have said, well, isn't this real world, this Twitter or this Facebook community, isn't this the real world too? And in ways it is. I've seen that argument get quite heated, that there is no difference, and other people say, well, no, it is really fundamentally different.
That's when I catch myself doing occasionally as well, using the IRL. And it's like, no, the online communities I'm involved with are real life too. Especially, you know, with a career as a community manager. That's real life. That's about as real as it gets. So touching on the dysfunctional, unruly element, it's much harder to scale as you grow in size. So one of our participants, Andrew, has a community of about 25,000 people. And he's wondering if you have any suggestions for ways to keep a group of that size happy and functional.
Oof, that is a gigantic community. That's huge. 2,500 people. Of course, the Dunbar number would suggest that it's actually very, very difficult to maintain a stable social network that is that large. And my guess is that they have a lot of subgroups within that community, a tremendous amount of subgroups, and probably a lot of flow between those subgroups, so that people form little groups over here that are a subject, and that those tend to be smaller communities. You know, I think for the community manager to know that there are, if we look at Kimiak's model, there's going to be those voyeurs, those lurkers. They're there, and they're very important. And can we pull them out? Should we pull them out all the time? Are there ways to make things safer? I would certainly say that in a lot of the elements, if we see somebody bullying another person and just not helping them to feel welcome and open, that maybe we should call that behavior out, or quietly one-on-one try to get that person to bring the person into the community. We want to try to get those voices heard, if you will, the disenfranchised heard. I think to understand that subcommunities are going to form and need to form is probably really important. And what can I do to help maintain subcommunities while still creating events and occurrences where people from those subcommunities then come in together to celebrate as a larger group. A lot of times what we may have, let's say a company, for example, Acme Corporation. And Acme Corporation started off as a very small company, and it's grown, and it's now 2,500 people. And they've got their divisions. They've got over here manufacturing, they've got their office people, their sales people, they've got their R&D. And they have, by necessity, formed subgroups. But every so often, we still have that company picnic. We still have that annual or the monthly event where we can pull everyone together and try to get them interconnected and host symposia where they can talk about common problems as a larger group. So I would keep those things in mind as well.
Yeah, that's something that Richard Millington, who is the founder of Feverbee, and he's done a lot of webinars for us in the past, he touches on that in the community life cycle, and I'll go ahead and link to that when we put up the blog post for that. But it is just natural evolution of communities that once they reach a certain size, subgroups will form, and that's actually a good thing in the interest of the community. Another question, I think this is a good one. Mohammed talks about cocktail party rules that he learned about in a HubSpot training, and his observation that a community will only accept you as a community manager if they can relate to you. So he wonders about your thoughts on community managers needing a certain amount of time to get native with the people in a specific community.
Accurate, it's true. I think is in many ways, just as people, we tend to do that with one another. Find any group of people And, two people meeting on a train in Vienna will start, instantly we tend to ask each other questions until we find our common ground. One of my favorite stories was one of my dear friends was on a train in the Alps, and she got off to do a little hiking, and she met this couple. And after doing the series of things, well, where are you from? The United States. Where? New York. Where in New York? Upstate. And it got to the point where it discovered that the couple was about to visit dear friends of hers the following week. It was that much synchronicity. We tend to do that with one another. What is the common ground? So obviously, a community manager that does not share any of their own foibles, their own vulnerabilities, if they try to be too aloof, it's going to be difficult to relate to them. I find that the best community managers are people who can share enough without dominating the conversation. And that's, listen, community management is a lot like any emotional intelligence that we see in any group. People getting together, how do you make people feel welcome? How do you engender conversations between people? A good dinner party host or hostess will do that. They just know how to get good conversations going. They're not going to dominate the conversation. They're not going to let two people sit off in the corner with one another for the entire evening because it's just boring for everyone else. So how can you create better and richer conversations? In communities, they're frequently going to be doing the same thing. I think the cocktail party analogy is fabulous. Thanks, Mohammed.
Yeah, that the cocktail party thing always makes me think of, and this is a little insight into the kind of movies I watch, but Bridget Jones's Diary, where she's learning how to, be impressive at a cocktail party, and then she's saying introducing a person with their name and an interesting fact about them, and I kind of see a community manager in that light somewhat as learning about the people in the community so you can get them connected to each other.
So much of what we deal with and dealing in all of this stuff of sociology and this stuff of psychology, I touched on, influence and how we influence one another. And we talk about group dynamics. This is very, very exciting stuff. And this is where I love to challenge the community manager. We who work in social media, this is one of the greatest jobs available in our world today. You've got this job of helping people to come together to achieve and do wonderful things and lead richer lives. I think the community manager position is rich, and done well, you're going to be a constant student of human nature. So we look at how people behave with one another and trust and group dynamics. Trust is an interesting thing I see all the time. I see, for instance, if somebody connects with me on LinkedIn, and then 5 minutes later after connecting, they send me an email and they say, thanks for connecting. I'd love to call and talk about doing business with you. Boom. My trust shield goes up. I don't trust that person. I think a lot of times people try to rebound the other way, and they call up and they, thanks for connecting. How can I help you? And they've just put the burden of figuring out how I can help them on me. It was not a very nice thing. And by the way, our relationship is not far along enough for us to have that conversation. There's stages of trust that we go through with one another. If you meet a new person, you're on the dating scene, a guy meets a girl, if he instantly says, hey, come on up to my place, wow, he instantly lost trust. He was being creepy. He moved too quickly. There's a whole series of activities of just getting to know someone. Do we have commonality? Do we share a similar cultural background? Do we have any friends in common? Do we like the same movies? And little by little, trust is built up until finally somebody says, well, let's go out. And after, a certain period of time, they may even get married. But even that, if it happens too quickly, you're going to be like, what? You just met them last weekend and you're getting married already. That just doesn't make sense. How could you possibly have developed the trust necessary? So we have these things in all of our sort of interactions online and communities, and these stages of trust, if you will. So the point is that as community managers, we have this wonderful opportunity to be students of the psychology of all of these things of influence and trust and community dynamics, group dynamics, and behaviors and dysfunctional families. All of these things are going to be richer opportunities for us to be greater at our jobs of community management.
I think that's a really good segue into what I think will be our last question, because we're about at time right now. Saad points out that in its early infancy, the internet was a paradise for anonymous communications. And we're seeing this being reduced in many ways. As you mentioned, the example of the Huffington Post and their recent rule changes, same with YouTube. Do you think anonymity is dying for communities?
Saad, I think that's a really interesting question. It's as a student of the internet, there was this real interesting phenomenon that happened very early on. The thinker Sherry Turkle wrote a lot about it. Check out her book Alone Together and some of her early books. I think she's out of MIT. And that was an age in the early internet where, that cartoon that said on the internet, they don't know you're a dog. There was that joke because all sorts of people pretended to be who they weren't. We saw this, of course, in the 70s with CB radio. People borrowed handles and they assumed identities. And there's a real richness to that and an opportunity for people to role play and stretch and be other aspects of their personality. And there's still parts of the internet where that takes place. But it's interesting that social media, as it's grown, sort of came out of the world of journalism, that blogging came out of that world of journalism. And very early on, the journalism community sort of said, well, it's about transparency. So you don't pretend to be who you're not. You're going to be who you are. And that was the world of blogging. And blogging very much helped shape the ethos, if you will, of social media. A lot of the social media platforms early on, they did have people being anonymous or assuming different characters. And over time, we see this trend, let's say, with Google. Google is saying, no, you must be who you are. Now, some of you may say, ouch, that's too bad. Some of that role-playing really allowed for some really interesting things to happen. And this, like, being who we are sort of stuff, this ethos of reality has dampened things somewhat. Unfortunately, most of the evidence shows that communities in which people have the responsibility of being who they are tend to be more vibrant, healthier communities. The Huffington Post is probably one of the best examples of that, where a lot more engagement took place. A lot more people came out of the woodwork and participated in the community. The conversations became richer and better, and on so many data points. So at least by that example, we might be able to say that this non-anonymity is healthier. We can look to YouTube that has recently instituted non-anonymity. You must be who you are, and you need to be tied in with your Google Plus account so that we know who you are. And so will those inane conversations that took place, or those inane postings on YouTube, change, and will it become a more vibrant, better community? I'm not making a value judgment here, weighing in on one versus the other. It's simply that this is the phenomenon that we're going towards. Probably, if enough people feel the need to play out the role of role-playing and being something else in anonymity, that sub-communities will form where that can take place. But it looks like the larger group of society really wants that accountability.
Fantastic. I think that's a great place to end on today. I'm sure I speak for everyone who was attending today when I say thank you so much, and I learned so much. I'm going to get to listen to this again as I'm working through and editing it for the recording, so I'll get to a chance to absorb this even further. Like I said, the recording will be on our blog later, and it will also be emailed out to everyone who attended. And I just want to thank you once again, Ric, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. Feel free to connect with me on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever, and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.